Hi, I'm Margot. I stream art live on Twitch and I'm new to this YouTube space, but I would like to give you some tips and tricks about learning how to use watercolor. Watercolor is a great medium because you can create so many different art styles with it. While I'm streaming art on Twitch, I get asked a lot of questions about how to use watercolor, how to get started. I also have a lot of people coming in and telling me that they used watercolor in the past and they really didn't like it, or they just got frustrated and threw it out the window. So I'm going to be making a series of videos on teaching you how to paint with watercolors. None of the tips and tricks I give you are the law of watercolor. There is no law of watercolor. These are just different methods that work for me or that you might want to use in your watercolor paintings. Please let me know in the comments below any other things you need tips on when it comes to watercolor painting. I would be happy to talk about it in a future video. Let's get started. So first I'm just going to show you some different styles of watercolor paintings that I've done and the different styles that are out there. So the traditional watercolor paintings are usually very loose and wet on wet technique, which spreads out the pigment across the paper a little bit more. There's also more of an illustrative style you can do, which is very common in children's books. Then there's something more on the realistic side, which is not seen as much in watercolor as it is in oil paints or acrylic, but I find watercolors to be a really fantastic medium to work with because you can stack up the layers of color over and over again until you get that depth of color and realism. Of course, we're not going to tackle realism right away. Like I said, today we are just going over the basics, but I wanted to give you the scope of what watercolors could look like. First, we're going to talk about paper. Paper is one of the most important parts of a watercolor painting. You can't really use paper directly out of your printer because it will buckle and the water will break through the paper and it'll just be a mess. What I recommend is paper that is 140 pound or more. I like to use the cold pressed Canson XL paper. It comes in the blue little package like this, and you can get it in different sizes and all different thicknesses. There are also different kinds of cotton paper, and you can see the cotton paper has more of a woven look, whereas the Canson paper has a little bit more texture. To start, I would recommend the Canson XL paper. Feel free to browse your art store if you can. If you have the opportunity to touch the paper and see what feels nice to you for painting, as long as it says for watercolor and it is 140 pound or above, I think you should be good to go. So now we're going to get into brushes. So for watercolor, there are many brushes you can use, but I actually got really attached to a round brush. So I like the round brushes that have a really sharp tip because I like to do really tiny details. Normally, I only use 1 to 2 brushes per painting, so you don't have to worry about stocking up on brushes. You can use what you have on hand if you happen to have paintbrushes, or you can go out and just buy 1 or 2. So for a small, medium, and large, what I would recommend is a round brush in size 1, size 8, in size 10. This will allow you a wide range of sizes to choose from to create anything you'd like. So next we're going to talk about the actual paint you'll be using. So the first palette I have here is just one from the dollar store. I don't really recommend it too much for watercolor painting, but if you just want to have fun with some paints, then go for it. In watercolors, I look for a couple of different things. We want to be able to blend it out into a soft gradient, and I also like the colors to be highly pigmented so I can have a full range of values in my paintings. Here I'm just swatching a couple of different brands so you can see the range of difference between the quality of watercolor sets. Based on these swatches, I would recommend either the brand Prima Marketing or Paul Rubens for your beginner watercolor set. If you're going based on cost, Prima Marketing is more affordable and it's a great beginner set. Just be sure to get the set called the Classics, as they do have multiple other color combination sets such as metallics and pastels. So to get all the basic colors you need, I think that the Classic set is best. Other things you need to start painting are 2 jars of water, 1 for cleaning brushes and 1 for blending out details, paper towel, and a palette to mix your colors on. Now that we've covered materials, we're going to move into the method. So now we're going to actually get painting. So the first technique I'm going to show you is called wet on wet. This is the method where you use a wet brush and put plain water on the paper. Then you pick up the pigment and put it onto the wet paper. This makes the pigment splay out wherever the water is, so anywhere where you put the water is free game for the watercolor. I like to say that watercolor does what it wants within the constraints you allow it to. So by this I mean you can't control everything the watercolor does because the watercolor is water. Water will go where it wants, so you need to give it a border to stay within. The wet on wet method is very helpful. You give it a border to stay within and it covers that whole area in pigment. The wet on wet method is great for covering big areas. If you have a lot of paper to paint and you don't want to let your paint dry while you're still putting it on, put your water where you want to paint and then put the pigment on top and let it flow. You can continue adding more so that it's darker, and you can control any lines that start to appear. You can scrub them out because the water allows the paint to stay active until it dries, so you have a longer time frame to move things around. The next method I'm going to talk about is wet on dry. This is when you just have your watercolor paper and you pick up your pigment and you put it on the paper. And that's about it. Here I'm going to show you how to make a little bit of a gradient. First, I'm using the wet on dry method, where I dip into my pigment and put it directly onto the dry paper. Then I'm going to wipe the color off my brush onto a paper towel and dip the brush into some clean water. For some reason I use the water off screen instead of the other water, but that's okay, just dip it into some water. Then I'm going back in and touching the edge of the color, pulling that color out with the water on my brush and dragging it out in an up and down motion. I wanted to show you the difference between big spaces filled with wet on wet versus wet on dry, so that you have an understanding of when to use it. The place where I used wet on wet, the color is all even and smooth, and you can see in the close-up where the place where I used wet on dry, the pigment is stilted, and you can see where I started and stopped brushing when I ran out of paint on the brush. You can use wet on dry for big spaces if this is the look you're going for. If you're painting something textured like a tree, this method is fantastic, but if you're painting a soft sky, then maybe wet on wet would be more beneficial. Here's another way to use wet on wet. I took some clean water on my brush and put it on the paper in a circular motion. Then I grabbed the pigment directly from the palette and put little dots in it. You can see how it spreads out and starts to smooth and blur together. If they're still too far apart for you and you want them to blend more, you can take more clean water and make dots with the clean water on top of the pigment you've already dropped into the water. This will make it bloom out even more and give it a really soft blur look. Now I'm going to show you the wet on dry method in action. Wet on dry is fantastic for small details because you have more control over the paint and over the water. So when making lines with wet to dry, you can make big lines by just taking directly from the palette and scraping the brush against the side. And you can get even thinner lines if after you scrape the brush, you dab it on a paper towel a little bit to take off some more of the water. But you do have less pigment because there is less water, so you have to dip back into your palette more often. And here I'm showing you how I use the wet on dry method in this loose painting. I am painting some little blades of grass. As we get closer, the blades get more clear, so I wanted to have more defined blades of grass in the front. And I'm just doing lots of tiny lines, just scraping the brush quickly on the side before I make them. Making tiny lines like this is easier when your brush is sharper, so after your brush is wet, you can shape it with the side of the palette that you have. So we've covered wet on wet and wet on dry, which are the main methods of watercolor, and I've also shown you different instances where you can use them. Feel free to use these instances wherever. Have a test paper, have a notebook, and just play around with the watercolor until you kind of figure out what you want to do with it and how you can have control over it and when to give the control to the watercolor itself. Next, I'm going to show you how much water to use for each tone of pigment that you would like. So first up, I just grabbed directly from the palette, added no water, it just had a little bit of water on the brush, and I put it directly on the paper, and you can see that it was very scratchy and textured because there was not enough water to flow the paint. Next, I added 1 drop of water, and you can see that it's still a little bit scratchy, but it's very pigmented. This would be great if you were detailing feathers or hair or grass, anything where you don't need to flow the paint too much, but you're just going for direct detail lines. Next, I'm adding 1 more drop of water, and that's going to give us a lot more flow. You can see that the color is more even because it's not as stilted and jumpy around the dry brush. It is lighter from the previous pigment. You could still do detail work with this because there is not too much water, but it's flowing much nicer. So now we are more watered down. This would be great for covering bigger spaces. This would be great for wet on wet. As we're adding more and more water, it's taking longer for my brush to dry out, and it's allowing me longer use time and also more flow. Unlike acrylic paint and oil paint, watercolor gets lighter not by adding white paint, but by adding water. The more water we add, the lighter and lighter our pigment is going to be. We're trying to find that perfect balance between pigment and water to give us the right flow and give us the right color that we are looking for. So here I just keep adding water so that you can see an example of how one color gives you so much range. In this last one, I wanted to add a bunch of water so that you can see that it will completely disappear eventually, and even still, it stained the paper a little bit. I sprayed a bunch of water from my spray bottle and just mixed it in, and the paint in the palette looks much darker than what's going to appear on the paper. The last thing I'll show you today is how to lift watercolor from the paper once it's dried. Because of the transparent nature of watercolor, it doesn't allow you to cover mistakes by layering other colors over top of them. Instead, look at watercolor as staining the paper fibers. The good news is that stains can be lifted, even if not to 100%. To do this, reactivate the paint by wetting your brush and brushing in a circular motion on the spot where you want to lift the color. Afterwards, dab the wet spot with a dry cotton swab, a paper towel, or dry off your brush and use the bristles, wiping it off in between. Try not to exceed 3 removals in the same spot, as it will eat away at the paper. An alternative to this would be to use white gouache to cover the mistake, but keep in mind that if you want to paint in that spot again with watercolor, the color won't look exactly as it would on blank paper, as now you have an opaque paint underneath that you would activate with the water. This may sound a little bit scary, as it may sound like you can't make mistakes at all in watercolor, but in reality you can fix mistakes as you keep painting. And keep in mind that while you're painting in watercolor, you're going light to dark, so most of your mistakes will be in light paint that can then be covered up by a darker shade if needed. And with that, you now know the basics of watercolor. Congratulations! You know what materials to use, the 2 core techniques and when to use them, the ratio of water to paint, and even emergency paint removal. I'd say you're ready to paint. I know this whole video was a lot of information to take in at once, and I know I can speak pretty fast sometimes, so please feel free to go back and forth throughout the video and pause where you need to. You may not feel ready to paint, but you are. You've got this. I really hope this video helped you in some way. Please let me know in the comments down below if there's any other questions you have about watercolor. I will be making more videos in this series, followed by tutorials so that we can use all the skills that we've learned up until this point, and you can follow along and paint with me. Thank you so much for watching. I stream live on Twitch every weekday, and I'm always happy to answer any questions that you have, so feel free to leave them in the comments or come visit me on Twitch. Have a wonderful day and happy painting! Bye! For your art painting.